My name is Lillian Mills, and I'm the Interim Dean of Texas McCombs. In this role, I spend a lot of time with our industry partners and appreciate all I've learned about energy from our alumni and employers. However, like most Texans, I don't yet understand well enough what happened when so many lost power 2 weeks ago. Tonight, we bring together a panel of experts to help us understand prior choices, current effects, and future policy trade-offs. We have two hosting organizations for tonight's event, the Salem Center for Policy and the McCombs Energy Initiative. Austin is the seat of our state government, the home of our world-class university, and is a city where policy and finance influence the roles of traditional and alternative energy. I look forward to hearing panel members' take on how we got here and where we're going. And to kick things off, I'd like to introduce our moderator, my colleague Sheridan Titman. Dr. Titman holds the McAllister Centennial Chair in Finance Services at Texas McCombs, and he is our chair of the finance department. Sheridan has served as president of both the Western Finance Association and the American Finance Association, and is among the top 10 most prolific authors in leading finance journals. Dr. Titman's world-renowned for his academic contributions in corporate finance, valuation, and investments, and applies that foundational research knowledge to problems in real estate and energy, establishing our thought leadership in both industries. Tonight, I thank Sheridan for lending his expertise to moderate this energy panel, whom he will introduce next. Thank you, Sheridan.
Thank you very much, Lil. And I want to emphasize that my role as a moderator was not chosen because of expertise. In some sense, it's my lack of expertise. And John was emphasizing that I've got a group of panelists who are very, very much experts on these topics. And my job is to slow them down and make sure that, that I understand and the rest of you understand exactly what happened in the situation. So we're going to start by having the panelists first introduce themselves, and then we'll have a discussion of basically what happened in the last few weeks. So let's start with you, Becky. Just introduce yourself.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm Becky Klein. I'm principal of Klein Energy, a consulting company that works with electric power companies and other energy stakeholders. I was the former chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas in the early 2000s during the course of time when we were restructuring the market, and was ex officio board member of ERCOT.
Thank you, Becky. Ross?
Thanks, Sheridan. Thanks for inviting me to participate. I'm an emeritus professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering here at UT. And I guess the relevant expertise in this context is my work that's kind of at the interface between engineering and economics and policy in electricity restructuring.
Very good. David?
Yes, I'm David Spence. I'm a professor of energy law and regulation at the law school and also at the McCombs School. And my research is on energy market regulation, generally speaking.
Okay, and Bernadette.
Hi, my name is Bernadette Johnson. I am the SVP of Power and Renewables for Inverters. Inverters is the largest energy-focused software as a service company. The group that I lead, we have about 400 power market participant clients, and we build software products and collect data for those folks. So we offer unbiased third-party opinions and data on the market for various players, load-serving entities, utilities, power traders, oil and gas producers, a pretty broad range of folks, including government agencies.
Okay. And as a co-moderator who's going to be involved in the discussion after we get things moving is John Butler, who actually runs our energy center. Can you introduce yourself, John?
Sure thing, Sheridan. I'm John C. Butler. The C is very important around McCombs, and I look forward to interacting with all of you later when we get our Q&A started. So please use the Q&A feature inside of Zoom.
Okay, great, John. Okay, so Becky, let's go back to you and just sort of start us off, giving us an overview. We all know that we were very, very cold and a lot of us didn't have power, but maybe you can give us a little bit more detail on what actually happened.
Sure. I would just add a little bit on the weather front before I go into details about what happened. And that is we had extreme ice and snow in addition to being very, very cold. And we had severe weather alerts for every single one of our 254 counties across the state. You know, the weather forecasters were calling it a unique event here in this state. But the physical consequences of what happened, all of which yet to be determined. But what we do know is the entire energy supply chain was affected. By that, I mean from the gas production wellheads to the gathering lines, to the gas supply lines, to compressors, to the electric generators, to the transmission system, the distribution system, and the feeders that, that bring you and I electricity. We had generation plant equipment failures of all sorts. That means we had some nuclear, some coal, a lot of natural gas, a lot of wind, and a little bit of solar that was affected in all this. It's estimated that about 4 million people throughout the state lost power for days. We had rolling blackouts that many of you in the audience probably experienced the fact that they did not roll very well. And some water treatment facilities went offline, leaving about 14 million people across the state without clean drinking water for days. The roads were impassable for linemen and other emergency personnel. Ultimately, we had about 48.6% of our generation capacity that went offline. That, meanwhile, while we suffered supply scarcity, our demand went through the roof. At its peak time, it was over 70,000 megawatts, which is above what our summer peak is during those June, July, August, triple-digit humid hot days. Yeah, I'd like to touch on a little bit about what was going on at the time as far as regulatory issues that were happening. The electric transmission grid voltage fell precipitously below its optimal 60 megahertz. We were about 4.5 minutes from a total blackout. Our available gas supply was prioritized for gas heating and not for electric generation. So the lack of coordination among the different regulatory agencies, namely the Public Utility Commission and the Railroad Commission that oversees gas, and the lack of coordination with the ERCOT ISO grid operator exacerbated the problems. Meantime, the Public Utility Commission issued an order that incented generation of electricity at $9,000 a megawatt hour. And to give some perspective, the average wholesale price of electricity for 2020 was about $25 a megawatt hour. So that gives you some context as far as the disparity in the pricing signals that were in the wholesale market at the time. Overarchingly, communication to consumers was lackluster before and during the event. And that was, I think, all the way around. We have just barely touched on the tip of the iceberg on the financial fallout from all of this. Many load serving entities, by that I mean deregulated retail electric providers, electric cooperatives all over the state, municipal utilities. Many of those will face astronomical bills and have already been facing astronomical bills. And they potentially face defaults and bankruptcy. The shortfall in payments is estimated to be in the tens and tens of billions or more. We heard the PUC chair, who unfortunately just resigned, give testimony last Thursday that it could be 28 billion or more. So as you can see, it's been a cascade of events. And I think, and I hope that this summary of what happened is really a good point of departure for the panel to discuss why it happened, what we might opine, what got us here, and more importantly, where do we go from here?
Okay, thank you very much, Becky. We're going to later be talking about, whether there was a failure of regulation here. And that's something that's going to, I think, have a lively discussion. But before we get to that, I think we need to understand the infrastructure a little bit better. So Ross, can you give us some feel for whether there was something about the infrastructure that made Texas particularly sensitive to this type of disaster? Was it anything to do with, say, the mix of generation, the mix between natural gas generators, wind, solar, nuclear, coal? Any insights that you have about that would be very helpful.
Well, I think, as has been reported widely, generators of all descriptions had failures or outages or performed less than expected. Wind was anticipated to produce well less than its nameplate capacity. This is the time of the year where it doesn't produce much. It produced a little bit less. There were coal failures, there were nuclear failures, there were gas failures, and the gas failures were both in the form of the generators themselves failing, but also it appears, I think we're going to have to wait for the forensics, because of limitations in gas availability. So I think there is blame, so to speak, across the board, or to put it more appropriately, there was a common mode cause for all of this. It was the extreme cold weather, and it affected in different ways different pieces of infrastructure, but it affected across multiple pieces of infrastructure, all the way from freezing in water intake pipes in nuclear generation to freezing gas to other problems with thermal generators and icing with wind. So I think we've got a panoply of particular events, but all of them have the common mode of extreme cold.
Okay, so the point was the mix wasn't the problem. Everything was hit equally in some sense.
I think whatever the mix had been, we would have experienced significant outages. It might be argued that with a different mix, we may have had, instead of 30,000 megawatts of outages, we might have had 25, or we might have had 35. But I don't think we would have avoided rolling blackouts.
Okay, was it a matter of having not enough spare capacity?
I think that's a very good question. And my short answer is the amount of spare capacity that you would need to cope with 30,000 megawatts of failures would be on the order of tens of thousands of megawatts.
Okay, let's just put that in a percentage of the capacity. So if we had an extra 10% capacity, that wouldn't have helped us. You're saying we would have needed an extra 30%
That's correct. That's correct.
Capacity.
Now, it is the case that certain regions, such as PJM, are actually currently carrying rather significant reserve margins.
Okay, just to slow you down, most of us don't know what PJM is.
Please excuse me. Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, over on the mid-Atlantic states.
Okay.
So they happen to have quite a lot of spare capacity at the moment. However, the design of their market, the design of our market, is not specifically aimed at bringing forth tens and tens of thousands of megawatts more capacity than is needed on typical peaks, for the fundamental and basic reason that if you own far too much capacity, you're spending too much money. So I don't think that a different mix, or even frankly a different market design, would have fundamentally changed the fact that we were short of capacity. Furthermore, had we had a different market design and had more capacity, the majority of new capacity in the last many years has been gas capacity and renewables. If we'd had a lot more gas, then given that we had gas supply problems, I don't see that we would have been able to run that capacity. In fact, I think there's even some evidence that the issue for gas plants was predominantly the gas supply rather than their failure. Bernadette may have some other or more specific information on that. I'm not saying that one or the other is completely to blame, but I don't think having a whole lot of extra gas generation capacity would have made a whole lot of difference to our ability to meet the electrical load.
Okay, now the other thing that you hear about in the news a lot is that ERCOT, that Texas grid is independent, it's an island, and it's not really connected too much to the external world. If we were connected to the rest of the world, would that have helped very much or not?
So in the first instance, we are connected to the rest of the world. We're connected to the Eastern United States. It's only a limited amount of capacity, it's fair to say. But as it happens, as we went into the blackouts, the imports that we were getting from other regions were decreased. They came back again later, but there wasn't a lot of capacity to be had. In fact, in the regions around us, as I understand it, there were also rolling blackouts. So the fact is, just a little bit, having a little bit more interconnection to adjacent regions, I don't believe would have helped us. I think that the only way a transmission solution would have helped us would have been had we had tens of thousands of megawatts of additional capacity spanning many hundreds of miles. And although that's technically possible, I don't think that is on the cards from a regulatory perspective, from a
well, right now we're just talking about the economics of it. And so it's not just that I run a wire into New Mexico and connect us. It's going to require more than that.
Indeed, you would need to not just go to New Mexico, you'd need to build transmission capacity further, as I understand it, and you would need to not just go east, but build transmission capacity further. And ultimately, this is a trade-off between what we want to spend for occasional benefits in the context of blackouts versus the certain costs of those increased interconnections. Now, I should say that in the context of greatly increased renewable development in Texas, there might still be an argument for adding some of those connections, for example, to be able to bring that power to a wider market. But I think even if that transmission connection was in place, it's questionable whether or not in the event 2 weeks ago, we would have been able to import a whole lot more capacity into it.
Okay, so it's not just a regulatory thing that we can't bring in electricity from outside. There's a physical limit to how much we can import from outside of the state. And what you're telling me is that the physical amount of electricity we can import from outside of Texas now is pretty minimal and would not have helped us in this crisis. And to build more capacity would be incredibly expensive.
Incredibly is maybe not the right word, but it would be a significant expense. Now, Becky's earlier comments about tens of billions of dollars of losses, that's an awful lot of money. So in that context, I'm not sure we're talking about incredibly expensive, but we're definitely talking, I think, in the order of multi-billions of dollars for transmission expansion that would have helped us in this context.
Okay, so maybe as we go along, we may drill deeper into this because ultimately this is all about cost-benefit analysis, and it's very costly to be prepared for this storm, but there's obvious benefits associated with being prepared. So the other thing that I hear about a lot is our power plants and our pipelines were not well weatherized. And I think I'm going to move it over to Bernadette, who's thought a lot about weatherization. Bernadette, can you give us a little bit of flavor on what could have been done in terms of weatherizing the power plants and the transmission and the pipelines?
Sure. Yep. Good question. So I think when you're talking about weatherization, there's the power plants themselves, and then there's the supply, the gas supply primarily. So if we think about power plants, there's things you can do. And so some of the simplest things you can do are, it's things like on a like a wind farm, you're talking lubricants, heating elements, even in blades. There's cold weather packages. There's coatings that you can put on the blade so that the ice isn't as likely to form. Those things are doable. They would add about 5% to the cost of a typical wind farm. So that would be one option, and that would protect, because there are wind farms around the world that do perform in cold weather and extreme temperature.
And so when we go north to Colorado, where they've got wind farms, are they weatherized differently than they are in Texas?
I think they are. I think some of it has to do with, this concept of de-icing and lubricants, but also I think it's important to keep in mind the temperature swing that we're talking about in Texas is significant. So even within a week, we had 0 to 80 degrees. So an 80-degree temperature swing is significant. And so the problem there is lubricants that are good in cold weather are not necessarily good in hot weather. And so there's no magic materials that can handle all of this really well. And so that's part of the challenge with Texas, is you typically set up your infrastructure and your power assets to handle peak in the summertime. Peak in the wintertime is not usually an event that we have to manage. And so that's the other challenge here, is that nothing is going to be perfect in all weather. And you don't want to do something for the winter time that then causes an issue in the summer when you typically hit those peak levels. And now you have outages for a different reason. So that's pretty important here.
I see. So you don't want an outage in August when we need, air conditioning, because we're prepared for February, I guess.
Exactly. In other places in the country, you have turbines. It's maybe a gas turbine would be in a building, right? So it's going to be more protected from a cold weather event. But again, if you build a building around it, what happens in the summertime when you actually want that flow of air, your units are not as effective. It's actually typical that power plants are more efficient in colder weather, not extreme cold, but colder weather is better than hot. And so those are options. So if we think about a cost, call it, if we adjust for inflation, there have been several studies that have been done over time when you've had these types of outage events. You're talking about between $100,000 and $1 million per unit, depending on what exactly needs to be done. So if there's 375 thermal units in Texas, you'd be talking roughly 375 million to 400 million max. But it's significant, right? Everything we're talking about here is a lot of dollars, which rolls through to ratepayers or someone eventually.
Okay, do you have let's say that we did everything we could to prevent this in terms of building shelters for the power plants, making sure the pipelines don't freeze up, all that. Do you have any sense at all on the total bill for the entire system for having prevented this accident?
Yeah, and so one number I think that's interesting is other places in the country where you could have, whether it's a weather event, whether it's a gas supply issue, you have some facilities that have backup fuel sources available. So it might be LNG peak shaving. Now they're operationally fairly expensive. They're not built to be massive because they're meant to deal with an outage or a peak event, not an everyday use. There was an example, Piedmont, I believe, constructed one not too long ago. And it was built about a BCF of supply. So there's gas storage, and then there's the LNG component and the regasification to turn it back into fuel. That served can serve about 100,000 homes. So there's about 11.3 million homes in Texas. So if we were going to do that to cover everything, that would cost about $28, $30 billion. So okay. Huge expense. So that's on the one end of the spectrum. The other end is this more $100,000 unit to $1 million unit weatherization to protect against the vast size of resources coming offline at the same time. So in there is we'll call it the right answer, right? A happy medium that's the right cost, but not overbuilding your infrastructure to such a degree that you're wasting for a majority of the time.
Okay, but it's easily could be $20 billion to fully weatherize to prevent this sort of thing happening again, I guess.
I think easily. I think depending on what you do, and then that's not even, so that's LNG or secondary fuel sources. If you were talking about weatherizing or kind of winterizing, I guess, the natural gas fuel sources, then you start getting into additional billions of dollars, because then you're talking additional pipeline capacity, pipelines that are built to withstand cold weather. You could also need storage, natural gas storage, right? So those are other options that are available, because gas is not meant to flow east into Texas west into Texas during the winter. It's meant to flow out, right? Texas is a net exporter of natural gas and crude. So the infrastructure systems that are there are meant to actually flow the opposite direction, not bring fuel in. So to change that.
So we need storage here is the only solution to that.
Storage or these LNG facilities, but again, you have to be able to bring it in, then you have to store it. You have to, operationally, LNG peak shaving facilities are expensive. They're expensive to operate. It's not nearly as efficient as a gas-fired power plant or any other option you have, but you can do it if you have to. And where you see them is relatively small scale, 100,000 homes in places like the Northeast or the mid-continents of the US, where you do have pretty extreme events that can happen that can knock out your gas supply.
So if I have a gas-fired power plant, just outside of Austin to keep us, with power, I must have a lot of gas being stored for the power plant. Is that correct?
So generally not. I mean, it depends, right? So you're going to have generally, well, in the winter, there's also a seasonal component.
Right.
And this type of event isn't really meant to happen in the winter. So you have summer where utilities will routinely own storage capacity for natural gas to bring gas in to meet summer load. They don't always have winter service, right? Storage facilities. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I guess I interrupted you. Is the type of storage I need different in the summer and the winter? A storage tank is a storage tank, or there's a summer storage tank and a winter storage tank?
So there's three types of storage, but generally the vast majority of when they're used, if you're talking winter service, is actually to pull gas out, put it on a pipeline and move it to cold weather states where you typically need gas in the winter. So if you think about the pipelines or the storage that exists on the Gulf Coast of Texas, a lot of that capacity is leased by utilities that are maybe in Chicago or other places where they're pulling the gas out of storage, they're putting it on a pipeline, they're moving it up.
Oh, okay. So they don't have a lot of storage right on at the facility.
There's not a ton. I mean, there's always going to be some storage behind a city gate, but not a ton. The big storage fields, there's about 4 TCF of storage capacity in the US. It's for natural gas. It's huge.
Right.
A lot of it is on the Gulf Coast. You have salt domes that are high turn service. You have aquifers up in the mid-continent, but a lot of it is actually designed for winter, right? Because we use gas and then we need to fill it in the ground. In the summertime, we pull it out in the winter when it's cold. That's typically when it's used.
Okay, but that's long-term storage. That doesn't help me if I'm running a power plant and my pipes freeze up and I can't basically buy new gas and I just have some gas in storage tanks and out in the back to run my power plant. That amount of gas and storage is very small, is what you're saying.
Exactly, and that would be something like these LNG peak shavers. Right. So those are relatively expensive to run, not a huge amount of volume, and you're not going to have them typically right where you need them at a power plant.
So the point is, having more gas and storage would not have helped us in this crisis, is what you're saying.
I think it depends on where. If we built a whole lot of storage, new storage, and we held it especially for this purpose, could it have helped us? Probably. Would we use it 99.9% of the time? No, right? So if you look at it, the other reason is you have to incentivize this, right? Who's going to build this? And so what's happened is in the past 10 years or so in the US, we haven't actually seen gas storage built out much because the seasonal spread, the spread between the winter price and the summer price is too low. It's too tight. Right. It doesn't incentivize buying it cheap, keeping it in the ground, selling it later. That spread's gone away. So the incentive just isn't there anymore. So what we've pretty much had for the past 10 years.
Okay. So part of the thing is the prices aren't giving us an incentive to store a lot. And that's one of the reasons why these markets are regulated, because the market itself isn't necessarily going to give everyone the incentive to prevent this type of crisis from happening. I think one of the things that we've learned is it's very, very expensive to be prepared for this type of crisis. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's first, I'll hand it over to David Spence. David, can you explain a little bit about how this market's regulated and why it's regulated in the way it is? And to some extent, Texas is regulated differently than other states, and maybe you could explain that.
Sure, thanks a lot, Sheridan. And some of this has been alluded to already, but I'm going to let me just make a distinction between the way we regulate the power supply market in Texas and additional bodies of regulation that might also apply to the weatherization issues we've been talking about. So Texas chooses to regulate its power market by allowing competition and allowing the market to set prices. We're not alone in that. There are lots of other parts of the country that do the same. Ross made reference to a wholesale market up in the Northeast, and there's other places that do it as well. What's different about Texas is that our regulatory regime relies almost exclusively on power prices to send signals to investors to build new capacity or to be available in times of shortage when we need them. That's the way Texas, as a matter of public policy, has chosen to meet its obligation to provide reliable, affordable power. So our market is a little bit different in that respect, in that we don't pay people just to be available, generators just to be available in the future at some time when we need them, which gives rise to the question of whether or not that feature of our power market is what caused this shortage this time. And as other speakers have said, probably not. This was such an aberrant event, losing 48% of your capacity all at once. Winter demand peaks that were just shot through previous records. This is such an exceptional event that it's probably not something that would have been averted, as Ross said, if we were able to hit our reserves target using just the price signal, or even if we paid people to be available through a capacity market or through some other mechanism. Even if we had those reserves, it probably wouldn't have averted this crisis. Maybe it would have shortened it in some ways or lessened it around the edges, but it seems that the bulk of expert opinion is behind the summary that Ross gave about the effect of extra reserves. On the other hand, we also have these weatherization issues. Should we have weatherized? And there's another body of regulation that's administered by the North American Electric Reliability Council, whose regulatory reach does extend into ERCOT, and FERC is the agency, I should say, rather, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is the agency that is charged with national oversight of those reliability standards. And the current chair of that agency has been making statements lately about wanting to study the Texas situation. And in fact, that authority also extends as far as being able to order interconnections in Texas. So the previous discussion about not having enough connections across the border to get help from others, I agree with Ross. At the onset of the crisis, our existing connections probably wouldn't have been enough to avert the crisis. But as the problems lessened in the neighboring regions, perhaps we could have gotten a little help. And moreover, if we had some additional connections, we might have gotten a little more help. And so I guess it all depends on whether we're talking about completely avoiding this crisis in the first place, or lessening it or mitigating its effects in the long run. And the last thing I want to say about the weatherization issue is that the regulatory responsibility there is sort of, we call it NERC, the North American Reliability Council. These NERC standards, the enforcement responsibility there is a little bit diffuse and weak. It's not exactly clear who has the authority to order weatherization if we wanted to do it. I think it's something that it's useful to think about, however, outside of the way we run our competitive market. Our market wasn't designed for an outage that was 4 days long. The pricing mechanism that we have really never contemplated a crisis like this. The way we value lost load doesn't contemplate a crisis of this duration. And we've been talking a lot about the costs of averting this outage. We haven't really talked a lot about the cost of the outage itself. At the end of the day, we're probably going to see more than 100 deaths as a result of this outage. I don't know how much, economic damage will result, but a lot of it will be felt in all over the state. Apparently, we came very close to shutting down the Texas power grid. I don't know how long it would take to restart it, but I don't know. And I also don't know what the effects of the Texas economy going dark for weeks would be. on the national economy or even the world economy when you think about Texas as an energy exporter. So I think it's useful to it's useful to get our minds out of the price mechanism and that market for an aberrant event like this, and to sort of talk about whether or not we want to spend to avert a crisis like this in the future as something that we can address through regulation that's not necessarily tinkering with our wholesale market price.
Okay, a quick follow-up, David. And I like to use Georgia as an example because Georgia is a southern state. You take Interstate 10 and you go straight out and you're in Georgia, or maybe Georgia's a little bit north of that. But they have winters, they don't have these problems, or they have not in the past. Is it because of the difference in the way Georgia is regulated, or is it just differences in geography that allow Georgia to avoid this problem that we have?
Let me give you my short answer, and then maybe Bernadette and Ross might have something to say on this as well. But on the one hand, Georgia is a traditionally regulated state where the Public Utility Commission sets the rates that customers pay, and it's based on the costs that Georgia utilities incur. And they have an incentive under that system to invest in capital. And so they may have an incentive to weatherize their plants because they can put it in their rate base, which is the term we use for capital investment on which they earn a guaranteed positive rate of return. And so there may be some investment that's undertaken because they have an incentive to do so. Whether or not that is gold plating of the system and extra money we shouldn't have to pay for is an issue about which reasonable people probably could disagree. But the second difference I would guess, and I defer to the engineers on this, is that we probably have to plan for a much hotter summer system here. And I think my understanding is that complicates planning for intense cold as well. I'm not the right person to explain why that is, but that's what I'm hearing from engineers. That may be another difference between Texas and Georgia.
Okay. Do you happen to know whether outside of the crisis, Texas electricity prices are lower than Georgia? Given that we don't have all this weatherization in the base?
Yeah, there's too many factors that go into comparing price across geography for me to want to say, to be able to say that one way or the other, whether that's the case.
Okay, I guess the question is, to what extent we're going to blame regulation in Texas for the lack of weatherization? To what extent were we not weatherized just because it didn't make sense to be weatherized, because spending $30 billion to prevent something that happens once every 100 years may not be the right thing to do. And again, that's an issue that we need to discuss. Becky, you've been in the regulation business. You know the regulators better than any of us. Do you sort of have any views on how we regulate in Texas and whether it should be changed or whether we're doing just fine?
Well, certainly I would start by saying we are not just doing fine, or we're not doing just fine right now. When you say, should any regulation be changed, there's regulation and there's market design.
Right.
If you're asking about market design, I don't believe we need to change our market design. I do believe there's a lot of things that we could do differently, though, that this event has taught us.
Can I ask you one question before you move on market design? A big difference between Texas and other states in terms of market design is that we don't give incentives to basically, as we said, weatherize and add to the rate base and have excess capacity in Texas like they do in other. Should that be put into the market design category, or is that something else?
So we don't give incentives per se or mandate them. And the reason is because of how David explained the wholesale power market works.
Right.
And all generators, whether they're deregulated or monopoly owned, will at times some more than others, buy and sell from the wholesale power market. So, weatherization, if you want to look at it, is a hedge against power market costs.
Right.
And as Bernadette pointed out and others, it could be expensive. So to the extent that, as you were saying, Sheridan, that there's a lot of capital expenditure for a hedge that doesn't make sense for a weather event that has very low probability, even though it's high risk. Mm-hmm. We are relying on the competitive wholesale market pricing, in order to in order to really facilitate the fact that So I think that incenting weatherization is probably going to happen here in Texas. And I mean, regulating it, mandating it, directing it is probably going to happen. What that looks like is to be determined, given the fact that what Bernadette was saying, it may look different in different parts of Texas. It'll look different for different infrastructure assets, right? But I think we now all realize that that's at some level a necessary thing for us to start thinking about for winterization, not just summerization.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great.
Now,
I interrupted you. You're about to say something else.
Yeah. So your question was, should we regulate differently? And I think there's some things that we can do in addition to what we've been doing now. For example, scenario planning and, doing a better job, especially the grid manager, to scenario plan for some black swan events, and not just scenario planning, but also exercises that get all market participants to really be able to know what to expect in those kinds of events. And along with that scenario planning and exercises, really emphasize communication. As I think that at all levels among all participants caught us all off guard, whether it was ERCOT, the PUC, the Office of Public Utility Commission, the Railroad Commission, the load serving entities, or the generators. There needed to be a lot more robust communication across all parties, and especially to the consumer. So, that's even pre-event to begin with. And I think there's a litany of other things. I know the PUC is already starting to look at gas coordination rules, whether certain reps should even be allowed to index their prices with the wholesale price of energy or not. As we saw, one retail electric provider, Gritty, based out of Houston, provides very low pricing to the consumers. But the trade-off is that pricing is based on the wholesale market price. So when something like this happens and that skyrockets, everybody's left holding the bag, the end-use consumer. So it's really, a perplexing problem. On the one hand, a consumer is signing up. You can speculate that they know what risks they're taking, but they may not always understand that.
So do you think those consumers will actually end up paying those bills, or will they be forgiven in some sense?
I think they will be. I think a lot of consumers are going to be really hard pressed to pay those bills. I mean,
but they will be forced to pay the bill if they can. Is that right?
Well, probably those consumers are going to be directed over to a provider of last result. But let me put it this way. All consumers in ERCOT are going to end up paying higher bills. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that, and this goes into the financial issues that are starting to unfold, is that some of these load serving entities, whether they're retail electric providers or whether they're cooperatives or municipals, may not be able to pay their bills. There's one already that we know of publicly that is filing for bankruptcy. And to the extent that those market participants shortfall on their payments, that shortfall is uplifted to the entire market. So what does that mean? That means that everybody is left having to pay something more. That means generators are going to end up having to increase their price of wholesale power. Retail providers that are left as survivors are going to have to take their wholesale power price with premium, and they flow that through to the end use customer. So everybody's in this together. I think right now we're in the classic tragedy of the commons situation, where financially everyone's looking after their best interest, and it's not good for the market as a whole.
I see. I see. John, did you see some questions from our Q&A that you want to pass on?
Well, we had quite a few. David Spence was nice enough to offer one. You brought up I-10, and as they say in another school I went to, I-10 runs both ways. And so if you were lucky enough to have power during the week of the power outage, you noticed that El Paso was kind of making fun of the rest of Texas. And David Spence had a comment on that. David, you might want to just say it publicly.
Yeah, I typed the answer, but El Paso is outside of the competitive part of Texas. It's outside of the so-called ERCOT region. And so they are more like the Georgia utility we were talking about here, in which they have an incentive to invest in capital. And apparently they invested in some weatherization that mitigated the effects of the cold snap on the utility and its customers. This is the kind of investment that we talked about as the thing that might have been complained about as gold plating the system were it not a storm, but now they're pretty happy that they made it.
Okay. Is El Paso, prior to this, was their electricity substantially higher than, say, Austin, or is this a minor effect, or how do you think about that?
The literature on sort of comparing competitive zones to traditional zones is not unanimous in terms of the of competition on price. There are people on both sides with very strong opinions who believe that it has been answered. The problem is they have come up with different answers. And so there's so many factors in terms, including fuel mix and the age of their equipment. And so there's a whole bunch of it's really hard to separate out all the variables and come up with a conclusion. That's a long deflection. I don't know what El Paso's rates are.
Mm-hmm.
Sheridan, one more follow-up question. Somebody brought this up. I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal that said that the state of Texas had effectively overcharged citizens by something like $25 billion over the last 10 years because of the market system, which I was surprised by, to say the least. And so a couple of people have mentioned that. Would you guys care to defend the system that we have for pricing power?
Yeah, there's that article, as you might guess, has caused a lot of email traffic on Energy Wonk email lists and websites. I think its methodology is contestable. That conclusion was, the product of what I am told was a fairly, was a calculation about with which people can take issue. So I don't think it's fair to say that competition has led to overpricing here in the long run. It's and I've been a critic of the market in other ways, but that particular analysis I did not find terribly persuasive. I don't know what Ross thinks or Becky or others.
I agree. I didn't find it a persuasive argument.
The only thing I would say about pricing as far as our market is that it's very hard to build generation, especially merchant generation. In the scenario where we have attractive pricing at periods that are frequent enough to cover not only the O&M, but the capital expenditures. So, our market as far as wholesale pricing can be characterized as very infrequent, spiky, and unpredictable. So to the extent that we can continue to ameliorate that or improve that, I think that's important. And I know that over the course of the last 20 years, the PUC and ERCOT, with the voices of many market participants, has tinkered with the pricing formulas, most recently in the spring of last year. So, I think how we do that, how we look at our operational reserve demand curve is really going to need to be relooked at.
Okay, let's go back to infrastructure, and I'll go back to Ross, my infrastructure expert. I've had lots of people ask me about batteries. And if we would have had more battery storage, would that have helped much in this crisis?
So the largest battery installation in the world, there may be a bigger one now, I think is the South Australian battery that's 100 megawatt hours. We had basically 10,000 megawatts of outage for 60 hours. It was more than that, but to a very rough calculation. So you would have needed 600,000 megawatt hours of battery storage to be stored up. Need that storage, you need to have stored it. So 600,000 megawatt hours. The current largest in the world is 100 megawatt hours. So if you'd had 6,000 times more battery, you might have been able to do it. But that, like the various other infrastructure discussions, are not cheap. And in fact, battery is, for a once in a blue moon type occurrence, is probably the most expensive way to improve your reliability.
So Tesla is selling these little battery packs that you can put in your garage in case of crisis. And for $5,000 or $10,000, I could have had a little battery in my house to keep me going. How long would that battery have kept my house running during a crisis like this?
So I haven't looked at what the capacity is recently, but if you wanted to keep your house going, your $10,000 would have been better spent buying a backup generator, and perhaps natural gas wouldn't have been a good fuel, but a gasoline powered backup generator would have been a much cheaper option. Now, that ignores the greenhouse implications, but if we look at the size of the Tesla battery, I'm not up to date on the size, but I think it's on the order of 10 kilowatt hours, something like that.
Yeah.
For your $5,000, that would not, first of all, you'd have to have it charged up in advance.
So if it was charged in advance, how long would that have kept my house going?
Depends how much power you're using. If you were using 2 or 3 kilowatts for electric heating with a duty cycle of 50%, it would have run out within a day. If you had a heat pump that was not working very well because of the very low temperatures, and your heat pump switched on its resistive heating, that would be depleted in an hour or two.
Okay. But how about, my problem was I have gas heat, but my gas heater doesn't work if I don't have electricity.
So if you had a modest amount of electricity, it's absolutely a fair point. If you'd had a modest amount of electricity to power your the blower and so forth on your gas heater, you could have run it for quite a long time. I think that, however, points to the folly of, for example, in our current gas electricity infrastructure, prioritizing home heating, provision of gas to homes, because we think that will prioritize home heating. But I suspect a large majority of gas home heating also relies on electricity. And so thinking about it entirely in terms of gas supply was not adequate to our problem in this context. In other words, you need a bit of electricity, as you pointed out. Maybe the Tesla would have helped you. I would have to do the detailed calculations. I don't think it would have lasted for 5 days, but it might have lasted for a couple of days.
Okay, and how about if I had a solar panel on my roof? Would that have generated much electricity during this? Because it was pretty cloudy. Would I still generated some electricity?
If it were cloudy, it would be problematic. But actually, I think there were a couple of really brilliantly sunny days during the blackout. As it happens, some of my graduated PhD students, Dave Tuttle, who may be listening, and Han-Yong Shin, have looked at the idea of vehicle to homes, and in that context, have looked at the idea of having a solar panel on your roof, the battery from your electric vehicle, perhaps a larger capacity battery than the Tesla Powerwall. And we didn't investigate it for unprecedented cold. We were mostly looking at air conditioning. But if it's sunny every day or for several hours a day, we found that you could keep running for quite a few days with grid disconnection. If you had the infrastructure to make use of your the battery in your electric car and solar, and operate disconnected from the grid, meaning you need a special piece of technology called a grid forming inverter and the disconnect switches to disconnect you from the rest of the grid. But bottom line is you could have spent some money on that in principle and been able to collect some of the solar and at least help heat yourself a little bit. As to whether it would have lasted for 5 days, I think we'd have to do some detailed calculations. Because the weather was very extreme, right?
Okay, just to clarify something, I think you answered it, but in a way that I don't completely understand. But some of my colleagues do have solar panels, and as it turned out, they weren't able to get access to the electricity being generated by their solar panels.
So solar inverters, the things that connect the solar panel to the electric grid, by default, when you're blacked out, they switch off. You need to have a special type of inverter and a disconnect switch in order to actually get the solar power from your panels into your house when there's a blackout. That's for safety reasons for line workers on the distribution wires.
Okay, so it's not a design flaw. These are designed so that you can't get the electricity during blackouts. Would it be difficult to change that design so that, then everyone would have an incentive to have a solar panel just in case there's a blackout, just so they get some electricity?
There are products on the market, disconnect switches, grid forming inverters that you could cobble together today. I don't know whether a manufacturer like Eaton has a ready-to-roll product that does that conveniently, but I'm aware that various experimenters and folks that put things together in a homebrew fashion have put together that sort of equipment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. John, we're running out of time, but were there other questions from the audience that you want to pass along?
There's a couple questions. There's a lot of references to the $9,000 power price that ERCOT uses. And so I know a little bit about this. I remember it was $3,000 and then they slowly raised it over time. But could you talk a little bit about the purpose of the $9,000 price, where it came from, and then was it effective? Like, did it achieve what the market was hoping would be achieved by having a high price?
Who's that to?
David, since you spoke, it will be to you.
So that's one of the unique features of the Texas market. Our capped price is higher than every other wholesale market by quite a lot. And the theory is that by letting prices float that high, it will send signals to investors to invest in plants that may not be used very often, but will be very lucrative when they're used. And I think prior to this episode, we were starting to worry a little bit about, as Becky alluded to, that whether or not that was enough of an incentive because we were falling below traditional target levels of reserves. But it performed quite well last summer as a signal and brought lots of capacity online when we needed it. But obviously in this crisis, it didn't perform well enough. And that's what I was alluding to when I said I think the wholesale market is built for a sort of a range of experiences or circumstances that we foresaw, and this was an event that we did not foresee. I think that we deal with this outside of pricing mechanisms, at least that's my sense. And when we see our politicians saying that we're going to have some legislation that will essentially order weatherization, to me, that's politicians having their finger on the pulse of what people want, even if it's not being expressed through price in a market. I think people want to insure against these eventualities.
Any follow-up, Ross or Becky?
So I think another, David mentioned the supply side, but the demand side is also relevant here. That 9,000 is also, roughly speaking, a proxy to what we might call the value of lost load. In other words, the unhappiness that someone experiences when they're blacked out. And as a matter of principle, if you want the supply and demand curve to cross, even in these extreme situations, you have to come up with a price that makes people indifferent between being switched off and having electricity. Now, 9,000 may not be quite the right price for that, but at some level, it is the market clearing price. On the other hand, we might decide that we don't want a market clearing price for 60 hours under involuntary curtailment. So I think there's a demand side aspect to it. It's not only about getting all the generators online that can, but it's also encouraging demand side actors, not necessarily residential customers, but other demand side actors to voluntarily reduce their consumption so that other people have electricity in this very straitened situation. Again, let me emphasize that we may not feel that that's an appropriate use of a market for 60 hours, but that is the other interpretation of that high price.
Becky, anything to add?
Really, I think David and Ross covered it very well.
Good, because Becky, I have a follow-up question for you. And then I was going to ask Bernadette to talk a little bit about, we talked about these storage systems, but what would they actually cost? So I know Dave Tuttle just put something in the chat about, some Tesla systems, but if you could think about that for a little bit, Bernadette. Becky, I think it was you that said that ERCOT is just about an all energy market, but there are some other things that get priced. Is this a time to think about looking, for example, at the ancillary prices market and things like that? So if you could talk a little bit about other things that are priced and why, and then if you think this is an important thing to consider at this juncture.
Yeah, you have various other things that are priced. You have, as you mentioned, the ancillary services, and it's my understanding that they don't have a cap. So under this event, I have read reports that they have gone very high for some of those ancillary services. By that, I mean almost triple of the $9,000 megawatt hours. You have pricing for what's called RMR contracts, that is reserved must runs. So, that might be an issue. Those bilateral contracts with certain generators that are asked to be there when we need them. So they are, in a way, our small semblance of a capacity market, and we pay for that.
And Becky, I don't want to interrupt you, but I use the term ancillary services as if I actually knew what it meant. Could you describe sort of what that means and how the grid thinks about that, please?
Yeah, so those are the services that a generator will bid into in order to be there within certain periods of time. So there are various types of ancillary services, whether your generation asset can rev up in 10 to 15 minutes, or whether it takes longer than that. So it's staged and they're priced differently. And so in addition to ancillary services in RMR, you have also a emergency reserve system that is priced. So ERCOT turns to large industrials to voluntarily be willing to be interruptible customers. So in times like this, they are paid, even though they're volunteer, they are paid to be there on a moment's notice to load shed. So they certainly did that this go around. The issue is, can or do we need to broaden that program?
Well, as Sheridan pointed out during our warm-up meeting, there was a lot of demand response at his house because he was without power for 4 days. So it worked. So Ross or David, do you have any follow-up comments on that? And then I'll go to Bernadette for some cost data on storage.
I do not.
No, I thought that Becky covered it.
Bernadette, what do you think? Like, what is this going to cost if I'm going to put some kind of large storage mechanism in place that would have made a material difference?
Yeah, I think good question. I think if you're talking the Tesla Powerwall, it's about $12,000. There's some tax credits to get you down to about 8,500, 8,800. That's good for about 13.5 kilowatt hours. So that is depending on the size of your demand in your home and everything you're trying to run. You can scale it from there. If we're talking the big industrial or the big commercial storage, and a lot of that's starting to get built out, especially in California. There's some significant facilities in Texas now. The biggest one now just started. It's in December. It's Vistra out in California. It's a 300 megawatt facility. It's big. It discharges over 4 hours. So that's the key thing here is none of these things were meant to last for days. So that was a great point that Ross made. 4 days wouldn't have saved us. So today batteries are 4 hours, 8 hours, 1 hour, some of them, and you have to recharge them. That facility, the Vistra facility, that phase one, for 300 megawatt hours megawatts over 4 hours was $400 million. So a lot of money, right? So if you're going to take that and you're going to say, let's scale it up, you would need, I think for this event, if you were going to cover everything, which we don't need to cover everything because we didn't lose everything. But if you had to cover everything, we'd be talking about 27,000 of those and something like $11 trillion, like excessive, like it's the least efficient way. Exactly like Ross said, that is the last thing you want to do is battery.
Sheridan, do you want to take back over? Or do you want me to keep going with some more questions?
You can keep going.
Fantastic. So there are a couple of questions, and by the way, as a prequel, there's a set of questions that I would call forecasting, for lack of a better term. And so I want you to think about, other events we might want to look for. Are we going to get better at predicting these events? Can we use things like big data, AI, machine learning, et cetera, to help us out? So that's a place I'd like to go. But for now, a couple of follow-up questions. Number one, how does Texas or ERCOT, decide how to load shed, right? So when they look at that choice. And then number two, there seems to be some, I'll say, mild disagreement in the chat that the ERCOT mix was not an issue, right? In other words, our choice of fuel generation did have an impact. And so I think that might be something we want to clarify. But Becky, can you talk a little bit about how this idea of shedding load works and where you think about starting?
Sure. So the different load serving entities have different proportion of load on their system, right? So and demand. So they're asked to shed on a proportional basis.
Becky, can I just let me interrupt you for a minute? You're using a lot of words that are jargon that we don't all understand, like load and shed and all those sorts of things. So
yeah, thanks for catching that. Basically, when I say shedding load, that means just getting demand off the system.
Okay.
And so the different, when I say load serving entities, it's those entities, whether they're deregulated retail electric providers or whether it is municipalities or co-ops that serve the end use customer, they are asked to back off the demand on a proportional basis based on the proportion of demand that they put on the system as a whole. And I think, John, your question really begs more introspection and evaluation about just that, not only those allocations of how the demand is asked to be curtailed among the different participants, but also about how those different participants actually implement that directive. I really wonder to what extent some of these different emergency rollout plans from different load serving entities, needed some dusting off. And so I think that's something that I think that this is a lesson learned for all of us. And the fact that we haven't talked about yet those rolling outages didn't roll. Why is that? Yeah, I've heard a lot of various reasons. I'd love to hear, David and Ross talk about the perspectives on that. But so I think just from the lens of a humanitarian issue, I think, that aspect really needs to improve.
So I can tell you what my load serving entity told me about why the outages didn't rotate. I also lost power for 4 days. So Austin Energy was, as one of the utilities, was given a certain amount of demand or power to shed, and they chose circuits on which sort of essential uses were present, like hospitals, for example, or fire stations, and kept those circuits running. And because of the amount of load they had to shed, they were not able to sort of rotate within, I was told, those circuits. So my circuit stayed off the whole time because I'm not next to an essential service or on a circuit with an essential service. It was just the magnitude of it apparently inhibited their ability to rotate the outages. At least that's what Austin Energy representatives told me. Ross, what's your understanding?
The essential loads is one part of it. There's another part of it. I don't know if anybody heard the really excellent piece on NPR by Matt Largy, where he compressed his presentation into the amount of minutes that had the frequency stayed low, nuclear plants would have tripped off and we would have had a cascade. Matt's had an excellent article, but he missed one thing. It turns out that because we're a relatively small interconnection, 25% of the load in ERCOT is on what are called under frequency load shedding relays. What does that mean? They're the last ditch defense against if a couple of nukes tripped off or several many gigawatts of coal simultaneously, right at the same time. The frequency would drop, as Becky conveyed, the frequency had dropped a bit. Frequency would drop significantly, and there are special disconnectors that switch off that load if that were to happen. That is aimed at forestalling the sort of cascading widespread blackout that would have left us without electricity for a couple of weeks, okay? So 25% of the load is on under frequency load shedding. Another chunk of it, and I think in Austin it's probably another 20 to 25%, is feeders that happen to have a hospital on them. Anything on that feeder happens to benefit from being on the same feeder as an essential load. So when you add those two things together, you get about half of the total Austin Energy load was on either feeders that were essential and could not be deliberately tripped, or on under frequency load shedding feeders, which you can't trip deliberately because they're the last ditch against big cascading outages. So, but precisely as you said, David, when Austin Energy, our provider, and I went out too for 2.5 days, was called upon by ERCOT to do rotating outages, there basically wasn't anything left besides the non-essential, non-under frequency load shed feeders. I think there are probably some policy things. Becky alluded to some tweaks on how we might do that in the future. I think there are some things we might want to think about in that context. But that's basically what happened and why there wasn't any rolling in Austin, for example.
There was a question in the Q&A I saw that I thought it was, it's good to bring up, and that is as far as load shed, would it have made sense to shed load earlier? And maybe Ross, this is what you're thinking, but would it make sense to reevaluate the triggers as to when ERCOT does direct load shed? And to the extent those triggers need to be done earlier or at a lower threshold.
I think we'd have to do some forensics to understand whether or not that was relevant. For example, if some of the generator outages that occurred was actually due to low frequency events, then maybe that would be a good answer. But if the reduction in frequency was not the primary cause, I'm not clear that it would have been beneficial. It just would have meant people would have been outaged for longer. But I think we need to do some forensics. And I think in a wider sense, we've talked about the weatherization. We don't actually know, as a matter of fact, whether the 2011 report on weatherization was or was not followed by many of the generators in Texas. We don't know, as a matter of fact, whether exactly the same pieces of equipment that failed in 2011 failed in 2021. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I think there are a lot of things that we should look at forensically so that we don't get caught again, right? So that we understand what the implications are. And to echo something that I think David said, I think ultimately we're going to have to institute regulations or standards to deal with these issues after we've done some careful thinking about what are the costs, what are the benefits, and adding one more thing into the mix, which is I don't think it's fair to expect market participants to be able to predict how often these sort of events are going to occur and plan accordingly their weatherization. I think we as a community need to adopt some responsibility to say we don't want such an event to happen again, and we're prepared to think about how much we're prepared to spend and regulate accordingly on that basis. So to echo some remarks earlier from David, I think it's very important to separate the regulatory authority story and the regulation or standards issue from what we should expect the market to be doing.
So Bernadette, I know you've had lots of questions to share your numbers, and so I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you can think for a little bit about what it would cost in the event of this catastrophic event, right, where the grid effectively goes down. Ross, could you or Becky talk about what that even means? Like, how does the grid go down? What would possibly happen to cause this 4 to 6 week shutdown?
So if I can quickly answer that, if the frequency had stayed at its low level for several more minutes, nuclear power plants will trip themselves off. Why do they trip themselves off? Because that low frequency can cause mechanical damage to their mechanical shafts. So they put up with it for 7 minutes or 8 minutes. They're required to put up with it for 7 minutes, and then they can trip off. If that happened, if it stayed low for that 3 or 4 more minutes, those generators would have tripped off. That would have dropped the frequency lower. Other generators would have tripped off. The under frequency load shedding would have tripped. And suddenly all of the generators and all of the load in Texas would have been off and disconnected. We would have had a situation like the 2003 blackout in the Northeast, where a whole chunk of the system was dead. It turns out it's a very delicate process to bring that back to being live. You have to successively switch on generators. First of all, they have to be generators that can get themselves started, so-called black start generators. ERCOT has them, although some of them failed in the weather event. You have to bring them on, slowly bring on load to match it, keep the frequency within tolerance. This process takes a long time. ERCOT trains for it at least once a year, it may be twice a year, but it's the sort of process that will take multiple days. I think CEO of ERCOT, Bill Magnus, suggested weeks. I think it would be at least a week to bring electricity back to the majority of people in the state. So it wouldn't just be we get a generator coming back on and we can switch on a feeder, another generator, another feeder, and get everybody back on Wednesday afternoon, which is basically what happened in the event. Instead, we'd have a multi-day process. So that would be horrendous, okay? Absolutely horrendous, far worse than we experienced.
Is equipment damaged when this happens? Like, is that part of the issue, or is it just time? So
some of the tripping of the generators is to prevent damage to those generators. They say, I don't want to experience this anymore because this is going to cause me damage, or this could potentially cause me damage. So there is all sorts of automated equipment that's designed to disconnect equipment from the system to forestall permanent damage. Okay. Under most circumstances, if that didn't cause a complete blackout, we would just reconnect that piece of equipment. But when everything goes dead, even if there's no damage, it's going to take a week or more to get back up again. If there happened to be damage caused, that might even take longer.
Bernadette, any thought on financial costs?
For an event like that, or generally, I think it really depends. Just as Ross mentioned, is there damage to transmission lines, substations, physical equipment? Then there's a cost to that. I think we've already heard from some of the power producers. Exelon in their earnings call quoted just for this event, for their 3 plants in Texas, between 560 and 710 million. So they've got, I mean, there's a lot of costs out there broadly that we're just starting to get a feel for. And we avoided a catastrophic event, and there's still significant costs that's rolling in. It's not just these assets, it's also ag, right? I think 55% of the grapefruits were still on the trees. So that's a loss. The whole orange crop, I think of the 40 crops that the Texas Farm Bureau mentioned, only 3 of them are expected to survive: onions, cabbages, and potatoes. And we're seeing about 20% loss for those 2. So I think we're just starting to quantify what the cost is actually going to be for this. Luckily, I think a lot of the equipment wasn't the most dramatic part, but there's Exelon, 710 million. So it's not cheap.
So Becky, in a little while, I'd like you to close with talking a little bit about something I know you know a great deal about, this notion of energy poverty. Because I think that these costs and the event that happened, I think that's an important thing for us to think about. But right before we get there, Ross and David, if I remember right, there was a lot of concern that we could not manage the Texas grid with a significant proportion of renewables, that was largely overcome by our ability to get better and better forecasts and to use technology to manage the grid. Could you talk about that? And are there any technological solutions that might be on the horizon for us to get around problems like this?
Well, I think Ross knows more about the particular steps taken to improve our ability to integrate wind. But suffice to say that not just the ERCOT system, but other systems as well have managed to integrate wind generation at far higher percentages than we ever thought we could through changes in scheduling and forecasting. The question is, at what level of penetration do you start to see difficulties? And that's still an open question, I guess. But I would defer to Ross on the sort of specifics of how we were able to do that.
Well, and not just the specifics, Ross, but do you think there's other technological advances that could help in a situation like this? Like, could we get better at forecasting the weather, for example?
Well, I'm sure we can improve the weather forecasting. Whether that would help, it's all very good to know that it's happening, but if those events are not able to be dealt with by running out and putting insulation on, like many homeowners in Texas, I'm sure you and I ran out and put insulation on our pipes, right? But because we knew about the weather, I'm not sure at the scale of power plants that we're able to do that in the time that's relevant to have forestalled, say, the weatherization issues. I think they're things that we're going to have to probably prepare in more advance for, on the basis that we've just decided we're going to deal with it. We might also have to do it on a seasonal basis. Okay. Now, one objection to that I heard was that just a few days after our very cold, we had a day that was 80 degrees. Okay. And some of these weatherization things that are aimed at keeping things warm, if you left them on when the weather was warm, they might cause a failure because things got too hot. So I think there are a lot of subtle things that are in play here. I think one of the things that I find very salient is that Texas is experiencing both extreme heat and extreme cold. And although there are regions that put up with colder weather than Texas, I think the difference between the extreme cold in Texas and the extreme heat in Texas is going to be problematic for our weatherization efforts, meaning we're going to have to think about how to make it adaptable. in a way that other regions may not have those challenges. So again, I'm not sure that greater weather forecasting would have helped in the situation we had 2 weeks ago. I think we'll just have to commit to agreeing that we're going to weatherize for winter, but perhaps have to take that off when it gets warmer.
Thanks, Ross. Becky, can you talk a little bit about your work with energy poverty, and then I'll let Sheridan go ahead and close us out. We're getting close to time.
Yeah, thank you, John. I will want to put in a plug for the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. It really is focusing its research on the nexus between energy and poverty. And, what we've just experienced is really going to be difficult on low income people. If you can imagine $9,000 a megawatt hour, even though it's for 90 hours over the course of last week, is already going to put a strain on middle income customers, even more so on low income customers. You have low income customers that on average pay 12% more out of wallet than you and I, and in some instance up to 30% more. So I think that customers are really going to feel strained, and it could force a cascading event for some of them, which if they can't pay their bills, then that's going to affect their credit scores. And if their credit scores are affected, could affect, trying to get an apartment, trying to get a bank account, and so on and so forth. So, I really want to make sure that TEPRI and market participants remember low-income consumers during this time and going forward.
Sheridan, take it away.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for participating, but before I let you guys go, I'm going to ask you to make one prediction or policy statement. We know that rules in some sense are going to be changing after this event. This is one of these events that cause everyone to rethink policy. And as our sponsor of this event is the Salem Policy Center, we need to end on that note. So my question is, what do you think will happen in terms of changes in policy in Texas on the energy markets? And what do you think should happen? So those are two different things. I would like a pretty brief answer, so we're not going to go into any depth. And I think what should happen is really determined by, whether we think this is a once in 100-year event or a once in 10-year event. So when you explain what you think should happen, again, we don't really know, but maybe you can tell us what you're assuming about how often these types of events are likely to happen. So can we start with you, Bernadette?
Sure. So I'll preface this that I'm an economist by training, and I'm a free market economist. So I tend to veer towards let the market decide. But I would also say the power market is changing dramatically, whether it's distributed resources. Instead of these big central power plants, we're seeing more and more distribution. We're seeing demand response programs that could have played a role here. There were some comments in the chat about that. Even industrial commercial size demand response programs in ERCOT that helps kind of organize the load shedding or the turning off of office buildings, for instance, could have helped. So I think there's a mix that will happen. I think some of it will be directly driven by the market. Some of it will be led by regulators. But I would also say that an event like this and the high pricing that we saw, as chaotic as it was and as detrimental to some as it was, it also creates a lot of incentive for those power producers to winterize and to think of things differently and supply some of those gas sources. So I think even naturally there will be some response because of that. Some folks weren't able to participate in those prices, and I'm sure they wish they could have.
Okay, but do you think that the regulators should be mandating more weatherization or mandating more backup supply?
I would say no, because again, I'm a free market economist, but also I know that there's a piece of it you can regulate, and it's a utility piece. There's a part that's a lot trickier, and it has to do with wellhead oil and gas freeze-offs, right? So the well's turning off. How do you regulate that? It's a different entity entirely, different set of incentives. The pipelines, the natural gas pipes that are managed by FERC, that are federally regulated, that's a whole nother can of worms. So I would say there's pieces of it that the state can do. There's pieces of it that the utility commission can do, or the railroad commission can do. But there is no single entity that can manage all of it. And we had problems across the board. So it wasn't just one thing that caused it.
So we should have a more coordinated regulatory body for all these things.
We could, or like was mentioned, I mean, depending on how frequently this happens, it's risk reward. But you can protect, you could over engineer, and there's a great cost that could come to that depending on how far you go. And so can we do a better job of prepping the populace and having a more organized blackout so that it doesn't happen exactly the same way? Maybe that's if we don't want our bills to be significantly higher.
Okay, so we have a $9,000 per hour cap on power prices. Is that price too high, too low, or just right?
So I would say, I think let the market decide, but I would also say that price being capped and not tied directly to the natural gas price, because the natural gas price is the primary driver of power pricing.
Right.
So if things are moving independently, you could have that 9,000 be too high or be too low. And likely some of that happened during this event. You can't manage one without the other because they're directly connected.
Mm-hmm. But you think it's okay to manage that cap?
I think there will be complaints either way, right? California, I think they had $1,000 cap. Then there was arguments that it wasn't high enough and it didn't incentivize the gas generation to come on when they had rolling blackouts.
Right.
You look at other regions, they have a little different price. Sometimes you layer in things like capacity markets and whether you manage resources that way, and then your energy price is a little different. So there's lots of different flavors that this can take. No system is perfect and no grid is immune from blackouts during certain periods of time.
Okay, and I know that you don't necessarily know more than I do, but if you were the policymaker, would you be thinking about doing this, assuming that this is an event that can happen once every 10 years, or are we going to assume it's going to continue to be just once every 100 years?
I would say every 10. I mean, I think something will happen, right? Whether it's the hot weather event in the summertime, whether it's you're in California and you have wildfires, like there are different things that happen to the grid. And as Becky said, planning for those types of events,
right,
and manage them when they happen, no matter what happens. I think that's definitely something we should all take away from this.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. David, what's your view on this?
So in terms of what will happen or what I predict will happen, I expect we'll have a lot of hearings and some changes to the rules governing weatherization. What I hope will happen in the long run is that we will stop, we won't limit ourselves to thinking about this as a pricing problem. I don't think we price for this level of disaster well. I don't think, I think we underestimate the value people lost load of duration because we rely on measures of willingness to pay. And some people's, well, everybody's willingness to pay is a function of their ability to pay. So harkening back to the point Becky just made about energy poverty, it's the people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale who bear the biggest costs in these situations. I said my power was out for 4 days. What I didn't say was I went to a friend's house who had power. Right? I think I'd like to see us deal with this collective problem, even though it's a low probability event, collectively through regulation and not try to simply price it or set a price signal that deals with it, because I don't think we're very good at that.
Well, there's an externality here, isn't there? So we
yes,
aren't supposed to be good at that.
Yeah, both temporal and otherwise. But yeah, I think that's right. And you're going to ask me how frequently I think these things happen. I don't know the answer to that, but I will say I answered a question in the chat about whether climate change has anything to do with this. And I quizzed my climatologist friends, all of whom believe that climate change is real and human driven and a serious problem that we ought to be dealing with. And so do I. But they did not agree on whether the science supports increasingly frequent cold weather events due to climate change. There was a split. There are some who do, and it has to do with changes in the Arctic, and some who don't. And so there's not really a consensus on that yet. So I thought I would squeeze that in response to your anticipated question there.
Although if I take into account that climate change might have changed this, then I have to consider the possibility that it could be much more than once in 100 years.
Absolutely, certainly, yep.
Okay, Becky, what are your thoughts, final thoughts?
Well, I think there's some short-term policies or actions to be taken, and there's medium and longer term policies to be taken. So let me just touch on one short-term one, and that is something that ideally needs to be done relatively quickly. And that is what I think is resettling the pricing from last week. At least some hours of last week need to be resettled in order to maintain a sustainable financial market going forward. Further to that, we know there's legislation that's already been filed that would combine the Railroad Commission and the Public Utility Commission. Whether that passes or not, I don't know. But what I think would be very helpful is, if nothing else, to make the Public Utility Commission a 5-member entity instead of a 3-member entity. Conversations one-on-one among commissioners would be a lot more fluid. And it's really hard when you can't talk to your colleagues, or if you can only talk to them, haltingly in an open meeting. I mean, haltingly because if you invoke emergency Texas Register public notice requirements, you can talk to another commissioner with a 1-hour time frame. But if you're needing to pick up the phone and talk to different commissioners quickly, that's just really not doable. So enlarging that governing board to 5 commissioners, I think, would be a healthy way to be able to manage an organization and the market. I think to the extent that there's going to be shortfalls that aren't picked up by any federal assistance, for example, maybe we need to think about, in a longer term remedy scenario, statewide bond issuances or securitization transactions. And I know that's kind of a term of art, but we have a statute in place right now to do that. We've invoked it in Texas 6 times before to securitize large amounts in order to do storm recovery costs. We can, do that again for this specific event, whether it's recovery of energy supply cost or whether it's weatherization costs. So those are just a few of the things that come top of mind.
Okay, thank you. And Ross, you're our last guy, so you have the last word here.
So 2 things. I think better coordination between the gas and electric is something that would make a lot of sense. Is clearly been finger pointing in each direction, and that suggests to me that there's probably something that we need to get to the bottom of. But I'd like to finish by returning to David's point about whether or not we can think of this as climate related, which is really probably a question about, do we think the probability of these events is high enough that we should treat them as a once in a century or once in a decade? And I think after the 2011 event, as a community, we tacitly assumed that it was a once in 20 or 30 or 50 year event. And I think now that we have another event this year, we're going to modify that either by explicitly bringing that into regulation or as a community realizing that it's more often. And to highlight that, I'd like to mention that between 2011 and this year, it actually snowed one other time. It snowed on January the 10th in Austin. And the interesting thing about that is it also snowed in Madrid in Spain on January the 10th. It snowed about 1.5 meters. And the reason was the jet stream brought cold air down across both North America and Europe. These are a very unusual event. And then a month later, in February, we get another jet stream event. It didn't straddle Europe and the US, but it straddled a lot of the US. I think we can expect that jet stream events are going to empirically very likely to bring further cold. I appreciate that's something that is up for debate, but it does seem that just on the basis of a couple of observations,
it could be an issue.
It's plausible that this is an issue, that we will see these increased cold events, as well as the more conventional expectations of climate change, which is more hot events. So we're going to have to, plausible that we'll have to deal with both ends of that spectrum here in Texas. So we need to think very carefully about how to do it in a careful way that doesn't put all our eggs in the heating basket and doesn't put all our eggs in the cooling basket.
So do you think we need more regulation in terms of weatherization or capacity or anything like that?
If I am sympathetic to Bernadette's free market principles, but I think, and I think you could internalize them with the right prices if everybody had correct expectations about the probabilities of these events. But I don't think that market participants can be expected to come up with rational, consistent estimates of the probabilities. I think we as a society should think about what is our risk tolerance. And even if we think it's once in a decade, think very carefully about whether we want to institute regulations that deal with that outside of the market. So to answer your question in short, yes, I think we should deal with it by regulation.
Okay. Okay. I think we've gone over time a bit, and we've got a lot of information and interesting opinions. I would like to thank the panelists. You guys have been really terrific. I'd like to thank John Butler, the co-moderator, who did a great job as well, and for Megan and Mackenzie for getting this thing set up. I'm just very pleased everything worked so well. So thank you very much, and look forward to our next meeting.